Okay, so this is week 2 of our Four Horsemen study series. Um, and so let me just do a review of some of the material we went over last week. We started with looking at what the conventional views are that are typically out there. Just a rundown of the horsemen. Number one, the first rider is on a white horse. People usually identify this as Jesus Christ coming for his kingdom, or the Antichrist pretending to be Jesus coming for his kingdom. Uh, the second rider, who rides a red horse, is typically taken to signal war and violence. These are not particularly controversial because that's already sort of articulated to some extent in the text. That the second rider has a great sword and he takes away peace from the earth. And the third rider rides a black horse, and people take this to signal famine and food scarcity, or a rise in prices, or all of the above, because the rider has a pair of balances, and then there's declarations about the costs of certain things. The fourth rider is on what in English is referred to as a pale horse, and this is taken to refer to a large amount of death in the world. The passage says that he has power or authority over a fourth part of the earth. So that's usually taken to mean like that maybe 25% of the world's population is going to be killed during that time from war, famine, death, maybe plagues or pestilence, and possibly from wild animal attacks. So that's just like kind of a baseline for what I think is out there. And as I kind of looked through this week, I really didn't find much more depth in terms of what people make out of this. And as I pointed out last week, I don't really intend to contend with the idea that there are indications of war and possible indications of food scarcity, although as we get through more of the study, we'll see that there may be some questions as to what some of these things are indicating, particularly with the third rider in there, although I think the second rider on the red horse seems to pretty solidly indicate some kind of war activities. But so I said some of the questions that we're going to cover in the study include: is the first horseman Jesus? Is it the Antichrist? Is it someone else? As regard to all four of the horsemen, are they all humans? Are they just references to just phenomenon and activities that are going on? Are they reference to heavenly beings, or is it an assortment of those things, where one rider is a human being, the other is maybe an angel, the others are just phenomenon that are occurring? Then we said, is there any significance to the colors of the horses or the items that the riders are carrying? Are there 4 or 5 horsemen? Because in the fourth seal, it says that one of the horsemen's name is Death, and hell follows with him. So is hell a name for one of the other horsemen, or is hell an additional horseman, or is he a guy on foot that's running behind him? And then also, are death and hell, why are they understood? Are they taken to be personal beings? What is the significance of the fourth part of the earth? Is that a percentage of population, or is it reference to a specific geographic area? So at the fourth seal, we do have this reference to death and hell, which are capitalized. So the reason that they're capitalized by the translators, with good reason, is that they are depicted in the way that personal beings are depicted. So these are taken, one of them is said to be the name of the rider of that horse. Well, personal beings ride horses. They have names, they carry objects. The first rider is almost universally taken as a personal being, whether it's Jesus Christ or the Antichrist. So not only does this language, which could be figurative, so therefore, if it's a figurative reference, you could call it death, but you may not mean it's actually a being named Death. But the first rider himself is generally taken not to just be a figurative reference. It's generally taken to be either the Antichrist or Jesus Christ. So from that, it follows that these other riders are also likely not switching over to purely figurative language, but also are indicative of personal beings whose riding forth here may signify the onset of other events. And so we said that in the ancient pagan world, Death and Hades were the gods who presided over the death of mortal men and the location within the earth where the deceased mortal men went after they died. In the Bible, which in the Greek uses in the New Testament the terms for those Greek gods, Death and Hades, or Thanatos and Hades, we see the Bible attesting to other things that we would generally attribute to personal beings, as in Romans, where death reigns, right? Could be figurative, but the other parties that are depicted as reigning in the statements in Romans are all personal beings, whether it's us or Jesus Christ. We see the statement in 1 Corinthians 15 that the last enemy to be put into submission to Christ is death. We know that that could be figurative in reference to just the mortality of humankind in that passage, but the satanic angels are repeatedly referred to as the enemy. That's what Satan means. And so it's possible that this would fit, and it certainly fits very well if we take into account Hebrews 2:14 and 15, which says that the devil has the power or the authority of death. So if you take that into 1 Corinthians, then we would arrive at the idea that the devil has the authority of death and that he is the last party that will be put into subjection to Christ when he comes to reign. We see that in Revelation 1:18, Jesus holds the keys to Hades and death, and that death and Hades are cast into the lake of fire after the final judgment, which is something that happens to personal beings. You don't cast misery into the lake of fire or sadness into the lake of fire. You cast people, you cast angels, you cast demons into the lake of fire. So this all supports the idea that these are personal beings. And so that we have a reference to at least 3 personal beings among the first 4 seals, 2 of which are certainly the first and the last horseman. And then we have to ask where hell comes into this. We talked about how the New Testament and the Old Testament give the idea that the devil and other angels with him have authority over earthly kingdoms during this age. That's seen in Luke 4-5 at the temptation, in Revelation 13, which talks about the dragon's great power, in Ephesians 6:12, where Paul talks about spiritual wickedness in heavenly places. And then we mentioned Abaddon. This is one of the names given to the angelic king who ascends out of the abyss, which was a particular compartment or area within Sheol or Hades or hell. And so he's released out of the abyss. We'll talk more about his release, which occurs as the result of another angel releasing him. And I'll have to do the work to demonstrate that at some point. But I did provide in the conclusions last week the idea that if you have angels, wicked angels, who are associated with rulership over the subterranean area where men, wicked men in particular, go when they die, and another angel who is in charge of ensuring that mortal men do die. And that explains when we see Jesus saying he has taken the keys to death and hell, which is to signify his taking their authority, and that it says that the last of the enemy, which could be the devil, to be put down is the one who has charge over death. This would make sense out of why it is that Christians today still die, but they do not go to hell. Now that sounds strange to have to explain that, as I said, to modern Christians, but many of us don't necessarily realize that in the Jewish mentality, in the first century Christian mentality, prior to Jesus' resurrection, the righteous dead went to a place within the earth that was a place of waiting and comfort, which is seen in Jesus' parable about the beggar, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot of things working for the theory that I'm going to put forward, which is that each of these 4 horsemen are in fact satanic angels, and they are discussed in other places in the book of Revelation, which can help us get some more insight into what these seals signify as a larger part of the larger piece or picture. So first thing I want to do tonight, something that Enoch mentioned at the end of study last week, which was, so we've got Abaddon, and in the place where the name Abaddon is given, it says that in the Greek language, his name is Apollyon. So Enoch asked the question about whether that was a conflict with my theory, which was that Abaddon is the same as Hades, because Hades is a Greek name and so is Apollyon. So is there like a conflict? Like there's not 2 guys, there's 2 guys, one's named Hades and one's named Apollyon. Rather than my theory, which was there's one guy who could be called Hades, Apollyon, or Abaddon. He actually, what I want to explain is that these guys, these angelic figures who the Bible and other things set up the idea that they put themselves forward to be worshipped by the nations of the earth, particular ones that they ruled over, but some of them have sort of worldwide appearances in different mythologies and pantheons around the world. So they have multiple names, sometimes even in the same language. And I said last week that if we look at the Bible as a accurate preservation of the truth about the angels, the religions of the pagan world, particularly the mythological religions of the pagan world, are a fragmented and sometimes confused idea capturing some of those truths. And so the god known as Hades to the Greeks was known as Pluto to the Romans. But in the Roman period, Greek was a predominant language. So you might have people referring to him as Hades or as Pluto. So in the account that I have here, which is largely from Wikipedia, and I'm not going to go through all of this, it just lists some things about Hades. He ruled the dead. He was assisted by others who ruled over whom he had complete authority. His primary intention was ensuring that no one in Hades, in his area within the earth, ever left. And by the 5th century before Christ, the Greeks had started referring to him as Pluton, or Pluto as we know him. And then he has other names that he's known as, which are listed here, including Agasander and a couple other versions of that. And then he would sometimes go by Zeus of the underworld. So this article lists about 6 or 7 different names that this particular concept of this heavenly figure or divine or angelic figure was known as, even in the Greek world. So we then have to ask, why does John in the book of Revelation potentially give 2 or 3 different names for him in 2 different places? We certainly know that Apollyon and Abaddon are 2 different names for the same angelic being, but why don't we get a connection to that directly with Hades? Why is Hades named separately here among the 4 seals? That's something that I'm going to explain as we go. A couple other interesting facts about the mythology of Hades or Pluto is that one of the things he was thought to have is a set of keys, which were associated with the inability for other people to leave his domain within the earth. That's something we see reflected in the New Testament concept as well. There is something in the ancient Greek, Roman world and in other world religions about the gates of hell as a location somewhere, or various locations on the somewhere where the subterranean area was accessible from the surface of the earth and vice versa. And then lastly, I want to point out that this is from Jewish Encyclopedia. Abaddon in the rabbinic was almost always just synonymous with Sheol. That sometimes they would say, well, Abaddon is a compartment of Sheol or the ruler of Sheol, but it tends to just be interchangeable or synonymous with Sheol, as we see here from a couple of articles from Jewish Encyclopedia. So, for example, in Job 28, verse 22, in the English, it reads, destruction and death say, we have heard the fame thereof with our ears. But in the Septuagint, it says Apalia and Thanatos. So it's interesting here. We have Abaddon in the Hebrew, but Apalia in the Greek, which is reflected in Revelation 9:11. So Sheol in the Old Testament, though, is typically translated as Hades. The Hebrew word Sheol for hell, or the subterranean region within the earth, is typically translated with the Greek word Hades in the Septuagint. So there is a great deal, I would say a pretty good amount of biblical confirmation that Hades is Abaddon. Abaddon is simply the ruler of what would be Sheol in the Old Testament. And so the terms became sort of synonymous. So that's kind of gets us a little bit more information about the name. So tonight, the next thing I want to do is to talk a little bit more about, we've talked about Revelation 6 and we've gone through these 4 horsemen, but I want to connect this to other things because I don't think Revelation 6, at least these first 4 seals and the horsemen, is the only place or is unique in Scripture with this kind of imagery. And so I want to see what we can learn by finding some of the other places. And there's a few others besides the ones I mentioned. I want to pull out the ones that I think are particularly helpful and instructive about this. And so I'm going to start with the book of Zechariah. Zechariah being written about the time during the time period of the restoration after the Babylonian captivity, when the Jewish people are coming back from Persia and Babylon into the land of Judah and Jerusalem, and they're rebuilding the city, and they're reestablishing the temple and temple activities. And so in Zechariah chapter 1, verse 8, it says, I saw by night and beheld a man riding upon a red horse. And he stood among the myrtle trees, and behind him there were others on red horses, speckled horses, and white horses. And I said, oh my Lord, what are these? And the angel that talked with me said, I will show you what they are. And then it says, these are they whom the Lord has sent out to walk to and fro in the earth. And they have walked to and fro in the earth, and behold, the earth is still, and it's at rest. And then I lifted up my eyes, and I saw 4 horns. I said, well, what are these? And he answered and said to me, these are the horns which have scattered Judah and Israel and Jerusalem. And the Lord showed me 4 carpenters. And I said, what are these here to do? He said, these are the horns which have scattered Judah, and these 4 carpenters have come to fray them and to cast out the horns of the Gentiles, who've lifted up their horn over the land of Judah to scatter it. So we have a couple things here that are, of interest, and one thing in particular that seems to be relevant potentially to Revelation, which is the idea of different horsemen. Here we only have what seem to be 3 or 4 horsemen. Like we might have 2 riders on red horses, and then a rider on a speckled horse and one on a white horse. But we also have the mentions of 4 horns, which are somehow associated with Gentile nations that have brought destruction and difficulty to the people of Judah and Israel. And then we have what is called 4 carpenters, who are working to undo or put a stop to the horns of the Gentile nations. So we've got these associations here. And so then I want to move to Zechariah 6, and then we'll talk a little bit more about both of these. In this subsequent vision, Zechariah says, I turned and I lifted my eyes, and I looked, and behold, there came 4 chariots. In the first chariot, there were red horses. In the second chariot, black horses. In the third chariot, white horses. And in the fourth chariot, grizzled and bay horses. And I answered and said, the angel that talked with me, what are these? And he said, these are the 4 spirits of the heavens. Now, note that in the Hebrew, spirit could also be wind. And then it says in verse 6, which I think are interesting, the black horses go forth to the north, the white go after them. So the white and the black horses are going in the same direction. So think about this. The black horses ride forth, and the white horses follow after them. And then he says the grizzled and go towards the south, etc. And so I don't want to get into the specifics of this situation, but some of this has to do with the stirring up of nations and the struggle between the Gentile nations and the people of Israel when they're living in their land. And there's this imagery of horseback or charioteers with horses of different colors. And in the case of chapter 6, one set of horses follows after the other. And so when we take that with us into the book of Revelation, we may be able to get some particular ideas about what's going on. But the 4 horsemen, and here we have horsemen, we also have mention of the 4 spirits of the 4 winds. So then we can go to Daniel, Daniel chapter 7, in which Daniel has this dream of these 4 beasts that come up. They represent kingdoms on the earth. And it says that, behold, the 4 winds of heaven strove upon the great sea. And then 4 great beasts come up out of the sea, each diverse from one another. And he explains these great beasts, which are 4 kings which will arise out of the earth. So these are earthly kings and their kingdoms that come into power, emerge because of the activities of the 4 winds of heaven, or we might say the 4 spirits of heaven. So there's some similarities here to Zechariah. The number 4, for one, the use of the 4 winds or spirits, which in Zechariah 6 was a reference to angelic horsemen. And so, okay, there's some similarities here. Now, if we go to Revelation 13, we see that there's a beast depicted at the very beginning of chapter 13 that has 7 horns and 7 heads and 10 horns, and it has it's described as having a body like a leopard, feet as a bear, and a mouth as a lion, and then 10 horns, which are each features of the different four beasts that Daniel 7 explains arise on the earth as a result of the activities of the four winds of heaven. So now we've got another connection that we see these angelic winds, and their activity results in earthly empires, of which Revelation is drawing upon that reference when it begins to talk about certain things in chapter 13. So in Daniel chapter 10, chapter 11, chapter 9, and chapter 12, along with Revelation chapter 12:7, we do have references to angelic princes or rulers who are associated with particular earthly kingdoms. In Daniel, it's the Babylonians, the Greeks, and the Persians, or I should say the Greeks, the Persians, and then whoever comes after the Greeks, which would be the Romans, as symbolized by these beasts. So when we get to Revelation chapter 7, again, we've just read chapter 6 last week, talking about the four seals and the four horsemen. Right after that, in chapter 7, because it's only a few more verses after the horsemen are discussed in chapter 6, that we're into the beginning of chapter 7. And it says in verse 1 of chapter 7, after these things I saw four angels standing on the four corners, or quarters, we might say, of the earth, holding the four winds of the earth, that the wind should not blow on the earth, nor on the sea, nor on any tree. So in Zechariah, we had carpenters and horns sort of as oppositional forces. There were four of each of them. One was associated with the Gentiles, and they're the nations that were used to disrupt and disturb and subdue Israel. And the others, the four carpenters, were a force of good to support Israel and to turn back the work of the four horns. And so here we have two different groups, the four angels who are holding the four winds. So there's four angels and there's four winds. So we've also talked about how in Zechariah 6, the four charioteers that were there, the four different charioteers were there, are described as the four winds. So we can probably assume, or at least we have a good reason to begin to consider, that here in chapter 7, verse 1, what we have is two groups of angels. Each group has four angels in it. The one group plainly is holding the other group, and the other group is known as the four winds, or the four spirits of heaven. And what they do, if you look at Daniel in particular, they stir up the nations who, as Zechariah explains, then cause problems for Israel when they're living in the land. And so that seems to be what chapter 7 may be talking about, because then immediately we're talking about the sealing of 144,000 people of Jewish lineage. And here, those four angelic winds are not allowed to do anything to harm anyone until those 144 have been sealed. And so they're being held back. So you can imagine maybe that chapter 7 of Revelation is talking about the carpenters and the horns. Both angelic groups. The horns are here being restrained from doing anything to stir up any earthly kingdoms to cause problems for Israel until God has sealed the 144,000.
Hey, Scott.
Yeah, go ahead, Don.
I was just, and if this doesn't make sense or doesn't tie in, please just skip over it. But would this be a situation like by the mechanism by which God ordains and works with the different nations on the earth and sets up kings, that he does this through angels, and his angels either restrict or allow the other angels to go forward and do this, and there's a mechanism in place, and this is how it happens historically? Or I mean,
it certainly
it's
seems to be part of this process that that God ultimately makes his decision. He also has authorized, given a certain amount of authority to the devil, who makes decisions about what nation's going to rule next, or et cetera, but that God still does have limits, as you're saying, through that he exercises through his angels, whether it be Michael or Gabriel, as in Daniel chapter 10, or other angels working with them to withhold or to hold back that whatever plan that the satanic angels are doing. Yeah, I think that's it all fits together with that idea.
I mean, otherwise you'd have a scenario in which, and I'm not saying it's not possible, because God, he can do what he wants, but that he is he has set up or ordained or set in order mechanisms to govern and have things work, and by those mechanisms is how things come into I say existence, but in happen, as opposed to God personally interacting every time.
Yeah, I mean,
Um,
it's unclear. I mean, mechanisms is a, intentionally, I know, like, we don't understand what it's just a vague way of saying a way things get done. I suppose it
right.
means without direct personal intervention in this case. Yeah, I don't know what the system is specifically. It seems like God does permit, and in other times authorizes intervention by his angels to change the course or put an end to certain things or their timing. So that does certainly seem to
Yeah.
be part of the way God
I
handles it.
guess I was thinking more as opposed to like a Calvinistic sense where, God is
Oh, well,
individually
yeah,
working with
certainly.
people.
But that,
But
yeah.
that's outside the scope of the study, but it's just interesting that with regards to these angels and winds and horns and stuff,
Yeah, it
that there
certainly
seems to
would.
be a very there's enough information in the Bible to indicate that there are processes in place by beings that are doing things and manipulating things and setting up earthly kingdoms and rulers
Yeah, I
and
mean,
working. So
in as much,
anyway,
certainly in as much as any sense of antagonism or opposition
right.
to God is, in my view, sort of contrary to Calvinism. But
Sure.
yeah,
And I didn't mean to
so
go down that
no,
route. I'm just saying I
let's
think it's interesting that if you read the Bible in these different patches in the Old Testament and in Revelation, that it's interesting that this stuff doesn't just happen by
yeah.
like a series of unfortunate events, or God's just going down and specifically working with individuals here and there. There
Yeah.
seems to be a process in place by both
Yeah,
sides.
that
That's
heaven
all.
certainly seems to be involved in the course of history and the preeminence of the nations that deal with Israel, at least. So
Yeah.
when we go back to Revelation, and we're seeing, okay, these sorts of associations with Daniel and Zechariah, we can maybe begin to think that what chapter 7 is laying out, having already seen the first four seals, that all the first six seals are opened before chapter 7. The seventh seal is opened in chapter 8. So the having introduced the four horsemen, maybe expecting us to be familiar with Daniel and Zechariah, chapter 7 simply switches to the alternate language, which Old Testament students would recognize, to now refer to those horsemen as four winds, and to here depict them with their counterparts who are restraining or holding them. And we see that oppositional relationship depicted, not only in chapter 12 of Revelation between Michael and his angels and the devil and his angels in heaven, but also in Daniel chapter 10, where Gabriel and Michael are struggling with the prince of Persia and his forces, who were withholding them from going about what God wants them to do. So this concept of these parties working against each other, the impact on the earth is interesting. And so I think that the reason I bring chapter 7 into this is because it's going to be important as we move into our look at the trumpets, which we'll get to at some point. So when we look at these angels in chapter 7 and we see the wind, or the four winds, are not allowed to blow on the earth or the sea or any tree, which is then stated to be that they can't hurt the earth and the sea and presumably the trees, right? In chapter 9, which we'll come back to again later, there's another reference there saying that there's a party there that is told that they can't hurt the grass of the earth or any green thing or any tree, but only the men which don't have the seal of God in their forehead. So we're going to have to work through who can be hurt when and by whom. But when we look at chapter 9 and we talk about what's going on there at this fifth seal, we'll see that these are spiritual beings. I think they're angelic beings in particular. So we might then assume the same thing to be true in chapter 7 and vice versa. And so these are not merely winds, et cetera, et cetera. And similarly, the riders are not really just phenomena or events. They're angelic beings that are sort of directing or causing or bringing about the calamities and the events and the things going on in the earth at that time. So two groups of angels, and then the use of riding on horseback or charioteer work to depict those angels, in particular the four winds of heaven, and the four winds of heaven being associated with the Gentile nations that cause problems for Israel. And so let me see here. Okay, so what I want to do is we're going to come back and forth to the trumpets several times, but I want to talk about the horsemen in association with some things that occur in the fifth and sixth trumpets. So now I'm taking components of the first four seals and connecting them to the trumpets. I think, in fact, the four horsemen are discussed in chapter 6, as we saw. I think they're alluded to there at the beginning of chapter 7, and I think they're also discussed throughout the series of trumpets in chapter 8 and chapter 9. So what I'm saying is, I think this thing that we sometimes, maybe just leave in chapter 6 and think, oh, it's a reference to death and pestilence and war, and maybe the Antichrist, that these riders are actually featured more prominently throughout the book of Revelation, and there's a larger sort of story being told here, that this isn't just a one-off poetic device. And so when we get to chapter 9, which is in the middle of the trumpets, we'll come back and cover the rest of the trumpets later. But at the fifth trumpet, as the fifth trumpet sounds, it says, a star fallen from heaven to earth is given a key to the bottomless pit, which implies, again, this is not a heavenly like fireball. It's some kind of personal being. Talk about that later. And he opens the abyss, and out of the abyss comes these things that are referred to as locusts at first, but they have the power like scorpions. So they're not like regular grasshoppers. And then they're commanded to not hurt the tree or the earth or the trees or the grass, but only to hurt men who don't have the seal of God in their foreheads. And the shape of the locusts, it says, is like horses prepared to battle. So again, these aren't grasshoppers. And they're wearing breastplates. They have hair, and they have teeth like lions and faces like the faces of men, and they wear crowns. So, I mean, I think we should be pretty convinced that these aren't insects at this point, like the kinds you find outside in the grass. And they wear breastplates. And so at the fifth trumpet, when this abyss is open, it culminates in verse 11, which talks about how Abaddon, or Apollyon, is an angel who's the king of the abyss, who comes out of the abyss, and that these locusts, as they are coming out with him. He's their king. So they're part of his army, and they wear breastplates of iron, it says. And they have stings in their tails. And then as we finish with chapter with verse 11, it explains in verse 12, one woe is past. So each of these trumpets is going to signal a woe. And it says two more come thereafter. And we'll cover the woes again more later. I know I keep saying that, but there's so much to get through here. So verse 13 starts with the sixth trumpet. I heard a voice from the golden altar saying to the sixth angel which had the trumpet, loose those four angels which are bound in the great river Euphrates. So that could either mean that they are bound literally in the river, like they can't leave the river, or that they're bound from crossing the river from one side to the other. Later it refers to them as the kings of the east. So I suppose that these angels are not allowed to cross west of the Euphrates, perhaps. That's an option. But it explains that these four angels, so remember in chapter 7, we have four angels holding four other angels known as the four winds. Here at the sixth trumpet, we have a set of four angels that themselves are being held from doing anything. And notice that in chapter 7, the four winds, those four angels known as the four winds, are prevented from hurting people. Well, it says hurting the trees or the earth or the sea. Here it says that these angels, the four angels that are being held at the sixth trumpet or until the sixth trumpet, they're released, and they begin to have the angels that are with them, this army of angels that are with them, can then go and kill a third part of mankind. And so look at the description of the horsemen. It says this is the army that is associated with these four angels. And I'm just going to read this as it is. Loose the four angels which were bound in the great river Euphrates. And the four angels were loosed. They were prepared for an hour, a day, a month, and a year to slay the third part of men. And I heard the number of them. Thus I saw the horses in the vision, and them that sat on the horses. They had breastplates of fire and jacinth and brimstone. And the heads of the horses were like lions, and out of their mouths issued fire and brimstone. And by these was the third part of men killed. by the fire, the smoke, and the brimstone that issued out of their mouths. For their mouth is the power is in their mouth and in their tails. Remember the previous group of locusts that looked like horses? They also had a power in their tails, and they also wore breastplates, and they belonged to a particular angelic king known as Abaddon or Apollyon. Here we have a reference to 4 total angels and a group of an army that is associated with them that all have breastplates, and there are 3 different types of breastplates mentioned here. In this case, we have fire and jacinth and brimstone, and then we have the previous group that was associated with Abaddon, and they're wearing breastplates of iron. And so this is going to I'm going to tie this together, attempt to tie this together with the 4 horsemen. First of all, look at the statement that says, and verse 16, and the number of the army of the horsemen was 200,000. Now this could be taken in 2 ways. One, there's 200,000 horsemen in this army. And the Greek way it's rendered could go that way, or it could go this way. There's an army of 200,000 soldiers in the employee or in the employment of the 4 horsemen. So that statement, the number of the army of the horsemen, could either be the number of horsemen in the army or the size of the army that belongs to the 4 horsemen in total. So again, I'm not going to be dogmatic about it which way, because it's hard to tell. But this is the thing that I want to get to, which has to do with how to associate this with the 4 horsemen more particular. First of all, we saw in Revelation 6:8 at the 4th seal that Hades followed death. And I think that mirrors what we see in Zechariah, where at one point, I think it's in Zechariah 1, or maybe it's in Zechariah 6, the white horses follow the black horses. So when we see Revelation 6:8 say that hell followed death, the 4th horseman, I think it's just saying one of those previous other 3 horsemen is following the 4th horseman, just like the white horses followed the black horses in Zechariah chapter 6, which would mean that not only is death the 4th horseman, but Hades is one of the other 3 horsemen. And then we would have to ask which one of the horsemen is Hades. Now, I would argue, as I've said before, that Hades and Abaddon are 2 different terms for the same angelic being who ruled over the place within the earth where the dead were residing, or where wicked angels and demons were residing. And so we have 3 horsemen to choose from, one on a white horse, one on a red horse, and one on a black horse, because death, the 4th rider, is on a pale horse, or what in the English is a pale horse. So let's talk about which of these first 3 horsemen would possibly be Hades, or Abaddon, as I'm going to sometimes refer to him. So the other issue here is, notice that here in chapter 9, at the 5th and 6th trumpets, there is activity in what is called the 3rd part of the earth. First, that there's ability to hurt but not kill in the 3rd part of the earth. And then at the 6th trumpet, there's the ability to actually kill men in the 3rd part of the earth. But in the 4th seal, there is activity and authority over the 4th part of the earth. So this can either refer to 2 different groups that each have power in 2 separate areas: the horsemen over the 4th part, and the trumpet angels over the 3rd part. Or it's a single group of 4 angels, right? The 4 angels bound at the river Euphrates, or the 4 angelic horsemen. And at first, or at least in chapter 6, they're described as having authority in the 4th part. And then at the trumpets, they're given authority to impact the 3rd part, which would represent sort of a transition or a movement or migration or expansion of their authority over one part to another, to include both parts. And in that case, it wouldn't refer to percentages of world population, where you take, 1 in 4 people out of every continent on the earth, but that the earth itself is divided into quadrants, in which they have authority in one quadrant, and then they're able to expand that authority into another quadrant, from the 4th to the 3rd, or the 3rd to the 4th, whichever you're going to want to sequence these as. And I tend to think of it as they have authority over the 4th and then the 3rd part. And we already know that this concept of the earth being divided into corners, or quadrants, which is discussed here in Revelation, separate from the fourth part and the third part, is part of our world understanding anyway, right? We already do this. We have four hemispheres as we think about it. When we divide the hemispheres, we got the north, south, the east, and the west. That's how we think of the cardinal directions, the quarters of the earth. We have four of them. And so that's going to become important as we continue here. So let me see what I need to get out of this. So in Daniel 7, we have a single dominion over the earth that is then held by various Gentile nations in succession. And Daniel's particularly interested in the Gentile nations that rule when Israel is in the land with its temple. Then in Daniel 8, we have the concept of the dominion passing from one Gentile nation to the other, either moving from the east to the west or from the north to the south, as Daniel 11 depicts the struggle between the kings of the north and the south, right? Four directions, four quarters of the earth, the four angels or winds that stir up these nations that Daniel's interested in, that Zechariah is interested in. And then we have the devil, who is able to give authority to these different angels over the different earthly nations. So I want to now talk a little bit more about the idea of the quarters or corners of the earth as directions rather than a percentage of worldwide population. The four cardinal directions are often depicted in ancient culture and religion as an association with riders on horseback. So this is not a uniquely biblical concept to do this. The classical compass winds, if you look this up in Wikipedia, it says in the ancient Mediterranean world, the classical, which means ancient, compass winds were the names for the points of the geographic direction or orientation in association with the winds as conceived of by the ancient Greeks or Romans. And so they associated each of the four winds with one of the four directions: north, south, east, and west. So under the article called the anemoi, which has to do with these association of these wind gods, it says in ancient Greek religion and myth, the anemoi, or the winds, were the wind gods who were each ascribed a cardinal direction from their respective wind, from which their winds came: north, south, east, and west. They were sometimes described as gusts of wind, at other times were personified as winged men, and they were also depicted as riding on horses. And then under the west wind, if you look that up, you'll see it says in Greek mythology, Zephyrus was the personification of the west wind, and his Roman equivalent was Favonius. In Egyptian mythology, Huchai is the god of the west wind, depicted as a man with the head of a serpent. And then it also mentions that even in among Native Americans, the Iroquois, the west wind was identified in similar terms and was thought of as a zephyr. So in ancient religions, the four winds were gods or heavenly beings. In the Bible, the four winds are angelic beings. And in both cases, they're sometimes depicted as riding on horseback. And they're associated with four cardinal directions. Remember in Zechariah, the horses go to the north, the black horses go to the north, the white follow them, and then the other ones go in a couple other directions. So in ancient cultures, the four winds and the four cardinal directions were actually all each associated with a specific color. So that's interesting. It's not something we necessarily do, but this is fairly well known. And from culture to culture, the color specific associations to the directions varied a little. We're specifically interested in this case in the ancient Middle Eastern and Mediterranean association, because that's the one that would have been prevalent for the cultures surrounding the Bible, the biblical peoples. And so in Wikipedia under cardinal directions, it talks about Northeast Eurasia, which is, up near Turkey and that portion of it and farther up, Central Asian and Eastern European and Northeast Asian cultures. Again, that's that same area that we're talking about. They frequently have associations of color with 4 or 5 cardinal points. And here's their association. Green is the color of the East. Red is the color of the South. West is the color of, white is the color of the West, and black is the color of North. So that's the general associations of the ancient area surrounding Israel for the 4 colors. Now, the interesting part that hopefully we can see so far is that Revelation chapter 4's first 4 seals contain what could, for most of us, reasonably be angelic beings riding horses it may later or in other places be called the four winds, that 3 of the 4 horses match the colors of this exactly: black, red, and white. Then we have this color green, which I'll get to in a second, which is going to only confirm this case absolutely. Just to support that, the ancient terms of some of the geographic areas around Israel were identified by their direction based on color in the name. So we all know the Black Sea. We may not all be able to point it out on a map, but it's north of Turkey. So it's well north of Israel. It's a northern body of water to the Middle East. It's on the northern side of all those nations up there. It was known as the Black Sea, black north, right? To the south of Saudi Arabia, and just to the southeast of Egypt on that coast of Africa, below Iran and Israel, is what we call the Red Sea. The south equals red. And people don't realize this. I certainly did not. But the ancient name, and in some countries, including Turkish, the name for the Mediterranean Sea, which is the Western Sea, is the White Sea. So west equals white. And so we've got this, and then it goes on to talk about in this article here about green, about these other colors. So that's the color associations of the ancient biblical world. And that matches really well with all of the iconography and everything about the horsemen and the 4 winds. And then if we go to Revelation, we see, okay, first rider has a white horse. Greek word lukos, which means bright or light or white. Sometimes color associations in the ancient world aren't as precise. Like, we have millions of colors we can see with the camera, or we distinguish between cyan and ultramarine, and we've got all these color wheels and swatches and everything like that. But the ancient world wasn't always that precise. It certainly didn't use language that precisely with regard to color. So sometimes a word for bright and a word for white would be used in the same way, just depending on what they were talking about. Puros is the word for the red horse. It's a word that means having the color of fire, red, fire, fiery red. It comes from the Greek word for fire. And then the black rider is on the horse there. The color is in Greek melos, which means black, or in some cases it means dark. So these are pretty clearly associated. You can see why the concept of the 4 horsemen and the 4 winds in Zechariah, these riders on horseback, is a known cultural term from the period, associated with directions, which is why they're associated with the 4 quarters of the earth, or corners of the earth, in Daniel and in Revelation. And then we get to the last one. We got this one oddball pale horse rider on the 6th, at the 4th trumpet in Revelation chapter 6. And I always thought pale is a weird thing. I mean, I can imagine a pale horse. I think we've all seen light colored gray, light colored brown, some kind of situation like that. If you look at this in the Greek, it's going to be even more confusing unless you understand this. But the Greek word that is translated with regard to the 4th horseman, and the color of his horse, which is translated as pale, the Greek word is chloros, which for us is probably most available in the word chloroform, or chlorophyll, should say. So we're talking about the color green in plants. And in fact, this is the Greek word for green. If you look up the lexical entry, it just says green or pale yellow. We might think of grass green. Like I said, the ancient world wasn't as precise about colors as we are. We've got hunter green and olive green and all that, and we got yellowish green. They often had yellow and green sort of in the same category. It's the same word that's translated in the Greek of Genesis 1:30, where it talks about the green grass. In the Greek, it's translated with chloros, green. In Mark 6:39, where it says Jesus had them sit down upon the green grass, it's chloros. And in Revelation 8:27, and in 9:20 and in 9:4, when it talks about the green grass or the green things, it's chloros. So when we get to the 4th rider and we see that death rides on a chloros colored horse, it is a green horse. So this is from when I studied this for the first time, I was just astonished, first of all, about the alignment of the rest of this. But when you realize that this is not actually a pale horse, it is a green horse. And so the 4 winds or 4 horsemen are associated with the different directions, and each of those directions and each of those horsemen has a particular color, the same four particular colors: black, red, white, and green. So there's a pretty strong corroboration of this that, to me, pretty conclusively demonstrates that the beginning of chapter 7 and the four horsemen from chapter 6 are really just the same, discussing four of the same angelic beings. And so we get back now to our question about which of the first three horsemen is Hades, right? In chapter 9, we see that Abaddon, another name for Hades, the ruler of the angel who's the ruler of the bottomless pit, who rules all over all these locust-like horsemen, he's mentioned as Hades, who follows the other horsemen on the green horse, just as in Zechariah, a couple of the horses followed the other set. But so we got hell and Abaddon's different terms for the same angelic being, potentially. I mean, how many different angels that rule over the bottomless pit are there? Maybe they just say he has different names, right? I mean, it's easier than coming up with different angels. But we got the options of a white horse, a red horse, or a black horse as being the horseman that Hades or hell is. And I think chapter 9 kind of gives us a hint as to which one he is. Like I said, if you read through chapter 9, you get these different groups of soldiers or horsemen that are associated with these different four angels or angelic kings. And the first guy's group has breastplates of iron, and then there's another group that have breastplates of either fire, jacinth, or brimstone. Well, the idea of a breastplate of iron is pretty easy for us to conceive of. I mean, that seems like a reasonable material for a piece of armor to be built out of in the ancient world, or today. Iron is, but how do you build a breastplate out of fire? You probably wouldn't want to build a breastplate out of brimstone, which is sulfur, because anybody's ever seen sulfur, it's a rocky substance, but it's kind of chalky. It breaks fairly easy. It's not particularly strong. And then jacinth is the name of a flower. So I wouldn't want to be in that guy's army. I'd rather be in the, if you're going to pick your breastplate for a paintball game, you want the iron one, not the one made of flowers. But let's look at these words that appear with regard to the breastplates. Four angels, four different breastplates. Iron in the Greek, this is just the word for iron. No shock there. Same thing for fire. In fact, this is the word fire from which the word red for the red horseman comes. In the Greek, the words are linked. And then jacinth, it says the color of, jacinth is an antiquated term. Hyacinth is the term we would use. You can see the phonetic similarity. And so when you see this in the lexicon, it explains that this is the color of hyacinth, which is here it says a red color bordering on black. So think about that. And then the word for brimstone, let me look up the word this comes from, is hyacinth, the name of a flower or a precious stone of the same color, which in the other lexical entry is a dark blue verging on black. So if I think of dark red or dark blue verging on black, I'm thinking of some kind of purpley colored black dark object. And then brimstone is theon, which is just a reference for sulfur. It's an old term for sulfur. And so now I'm going to read some information on ancient colors. Just to be clear, this is from a scholarly institute, the Encyclopedia of Color, Science, and Technology, giving us some information about the ancient world and the use of color, talking about how their use of black and white. All ancient languages tended to have the concept of red, green, and green, blue, and green, yellow tended to be kind of associated with one another, maybe even through the same terms. Here it says, there was no generic word for our concept of green in Greek, although chloros eventually came to mean something like green, and we certainly see it used that way in the New Testament, even in the book of Revelation, and so forth. So I want to put forward the idea that the breastplates in chapter 9 with the trumpets and the riders, the armies there, are associated with the colors of the horses of the riders in chapter 6 with the four horsemen and the four seals, which I've said are the four winds, and the same thing as the four angels bound at the river Euphrates in chapter 9. And so let's look at this. Like I said, You could have an iron breastplate, that makes sense to me, but fire, hyacinth, and brimstone, those aren't things you build breastplates out of. And so most of the lexicons will tell you that the reference to a breastplate made of jacinth is intended to indicate the color of the breastplate, not the thing that it's made from. It's obviously not made from from a flower or whatever, but they'll just tell you that this is just a breastplate of the color of this flower or precious stone as other places, but it's more commonly a flower. Same thing with fire, right? We see even that the word for the red horse in chapter 6 is a word that means fire, comes from fire, it means fiery. What color is iron? Typically, it's a grayish, shiny metal. When it's pure iron, its surfaces are very silvery gray. So you've got a silvery gray, a fiery red, and a dark purpley black, right? A white horse, a red horse, and a black horse. And then here's again the thing that just is the linchpin that ties it together. Brimstone is greenish yellow, grass green. It's a pale yellow. I've seen cars this color. They're kind of a sour yellow with a little bit of green in it. And so each of the breastplates of this army of the four angels and of Abaddon or Hades has a colored that is matching or correspondent to the particular colors of the horses of the four horsemen or the four winds. The silvery, bright gray, shiny, it matches the white horse, right? That works. The fiery red and the red breastplates, that all goes together. The black horse, his guys seem to be wearing breastplates of a dark, iridescent, purpley black color. And then clearly the association between the color of brimstone with chloros or green, the green horseman. So that to me, it shows that the four horsemen from chapter 6, the four winds from chapter 7, and the four angels, including the reference to Hades or Abaddon in chapter 9, are all the same beings. And what chapters 6, 7, and 8 and 9, in particular chapter 9, are doing is charting things that happen as a result of the activities of these angels and the impact it has on the earth and mankind. So that really expands the role that these four horsemen have in the book of Revelation, from 6 or 7 verses in chapter 6 to an expansion across several chapters of major themes and events in the book of Revelation. So to me, that makes pretty good sense. I mean, otherwise these are arbitrary but very unlikely connections, matching both in number and in color and in concept, having to do with when and where these angels are allowed to stir up the nations of the earth, what parts of the earth they can move into, and the extent of the damage or the impact they can have upon mankind in those areas. That is something that makes very good sense for Revelation to tell us about. And yes, it's in very deep symbolic language or things that require an understanding of the ancient world's manner of reference. But that's what the book of Revelation is. It's not a here's a straightforward A to Z, obvious as you can make it, set of statements. It is a challenging book of parables and symbols that is not meant to be understood by people who aren't diligently trying to understand the Bible. So, there's no problem for me with accepting, all these layers of things you can put together, but it does sort of tie together in a larger way and makes more sense of some of the terms and why they're there. And why does the book of Revelation skip from one set of terms to the other? I think it expects a certain amount of savvy and attention from its readers who want to understand it, and that you're familiar enough with these things that you can do this. We all know from our areas of interest or our professional expertise that when we're talking to other people who have experience in that field or that area, we have terms that we use that have specific meanings to us that others on the outside who don't know that field may not be familiar with those terms. And we can switch back and forth from terms to terms, and people will go, okay, he's using this term, but I know he means the same thing as this. or that it relates to this, or how it relates to this. I've heard John and Don and other people do it with IT and tech stuff. I don't know what they're saying, but they do, and they're using associated terms and they're connecting these things. So that's what I think is essentially happening here. And again, I don't think the purpose of Revelation is to make this stuff obvious to everyone. It's to make it understandable to those who are interested in pursuing it. And careful knowledge with the kind of wisdom that Revelation often references is necessary to understand it. So I'm going to pause there. It is 8 o'clock. The next section of this, we're going to get into more about the whole series of trumpets and how it relates to the activities of these horsemen, which I say are angelic horsemen. Particularly, I've identified the fourth horseman who rides on the green horse as the devil, that Hebrews says has the power of death, which is why it refers to him as death. The first horseman, I believe, is Hades or Abaddon, whose army has silvery iron-colored breastplates, and he rides on a white horse. He's the angelic ruler of that army that comes up out of the abyss. And I believe he follows the devil in terms of the authority structure, which makes sense, right? If we identify Abaddon as the beast that ascends out of the bottomless pit, and we begin to associate him with the beast that gets power in Revelation 13, verse 1 through 10, see that the dragon gives the beast his authority and his great seat, right? His authority is derived from the devil himself and his authority that he has in that period. So the trumpets themselves are going to be a more in-depth discussion. So I think I'll hold on that so we can cover it all at once next week, and kind of talk a little bit about what's going on with these trumpets. So I will pause there. Any comments or questions or thoughts tonight on some of this material? Okay, let me just mark where I'm stopping at, and I'll stop the recording. We'll be able to get done a little bit early, so we don't have a super long session. Okay. All right, let me stop the recordings.